And I'd like today to round out our discussion of Hegel and perhaps move to some of the things which immediately followed because of the way he was construed. But conversation just now before class leads me to point to two different interpretations of Hegel, which I think have a bearing on how easy it is to understand him. There was, for a number of years, I think, in the English-speaking world, an interpretation of Hegel which tried to see him virtually as an 18th century Enlightenment rationalist trying to work out deductively a speculative metaphysics. In other words, trying to do in his way what people like Descartes or Leibniz tried to do in their way. That is to say, he was a speculative metaphysician. However, with the growing influence in the 20th century of phenomenology in Europe, an alternative interpretation has developed, which I think is much more in keeping with Hegel himself, from whom phenomenology developed, and which interpretation I've been trying to suggest to you as we've been going along. Namely, that we have to take seriously the title of his major work, The Phenomenology of Mind, so that he's not trying to prove something or develop a well-argued rationalistic system. When he says that the real is rational and the rational is real, he's not using that as a lever for another speculative metaphysic. But rather, taking seriously the sense of phenomenology as that has become understood in the 20th century, he's trying to describe, you see, the phenomenon, the consciousness of being. At the individual consciousness level, that is my consciousness of being. At perhaps the societal level, a nation's consciousness of its being. And in the case of the absolute, the all-inclusive, the absolute's consciousness of its being. Now, I think it's that latter phrase which may be difficult. Your own consciousness of being, that's not so difficult. And of course, that's where the emphasis in 20th century phenomenology has been. That's what Jean-Paul Sartre is about, the existentialists. But what Hegel is after is describing the universal phenomenon of the self's own self-consciousness, consciousness of being, as that unfolds. As, for instance, in something like the master-servant relationship in interpersonal relationships. And in that meandering through the situation of the Stoic, the skeptic, the unhappy consciousness, and so forth. Movements of reflection like that in one's own conscious being. And in talking of objective spirit, he's talking of the way in which national self-consciousness arises in the light of the concept of law and constitutional government. National identity begins to emerge, you see. Well, and when he gets to absolute spirit, the section for today, then you get to the third phrase, you see, the absolute consciousness of being. Now, the closest you can get to that in theological language of Judaism or Christianity would be to talk of God's own knowledge. And from Augustine and Thomas Aquinas onwards, theologians have indeed talked of the knowledge of God, not just in our sense of our knowing God, but in God's sense of God's knowing, and God's knowing himself, God's self-knowledge. Now, inasmuch as Hegel is process metaphysician, you see, he's thinking of God's self-knowledge, not of God as evolving, but of God's self-knowledge as being objectified in the world he's creating, you see, in the course of the unfolding history of the universe. And he sees God's self-knowledge as unfolding in our self-knowledge, first of all, subjective spirit, you see. And in a moment when we'll get to talking about his religion and his theology, we'll find him saying that our self-consciousness is really God's self-consciousness. God is conscious of himself through our self-consciousness, you see. Because if God is the all-inclusive being, then my consciousness is a finite moment of God's consciousness. And my self-consciousness is a finite moment of God's self-consciousness. So God's own knowledge of himself is a knowledge of himself even through our knowledge of ourselves, our self-consciousness, our conscious being. But then God's self-consciousness is objectified in, shall we say, his thinking of the world of nature, which he has created, you see. And certainly in the medieval tradition, if all of nature in some way was imaging the manifold perfection of the deity, if we contemplating nature are drawn to contemplate the perfection of God, then certainly God in contemplating his handiwork is contemplating himself. You see. But the fullest expression, development, manifestation of God's self-knowledge, knowledge of his being, is when the form of thought, logic, synthesized with the stuff of nature, you see, by virtue of the imaginative creativity of subjective spirit, as one part of the consciousness of being of a national spirit. Hence you get him talking of the art of different cultures, and the religion of different cultures, and the philosophy of different nations, you see. When the subjectivity, the creativity, imagination of the individual spirit, okay, in the context of that national consciousness of its being, produces art, religion, philosophy. These creative expressions are not only creative expressions of the human spirit, since the human spirit is moment of the divine, creative expression of the divine spirit, you see. So there's some phenomenology describing the consciousness of being, you see, a phenomenology of the consciousness of being, gets to describing that as it comes out most fully of all in these manifestations of absolute spirit. Now, if God's self-consciousness is in and through our self-consciousness, and God's creativity is exercised in and through our creativity, then the divine consciousness of its own being is in the world of art, another creative expression of the human spirit. Okay. Now, I think if you read Hegel with that sort of thing in mind, he's doing a phenomenological description, describing the phenomena, doing a phenomenological description of the growing consciousness of being. Okay. Don't look for him to prove things in the old fashion. Don't look at this as a speculative system with no grounding in observation. It's introspective observation or historical observation, all the way along. And inasmuch as history is the activity of the divine spirit, his discussion of art, religion, and philosophy is historical. Because it's in the history of these creative expressions that the movement of the absolute becomes most evident. Okay, does that come through clearly? It does to me, but I'm wondering, does it to you? Okay. I said every other day we've been talking about Hegel, but sometimes saying it in different ways helps. Cale? Does God have self-consciousness apart from us? I don't know what Hegel would say there, because his emphasis in the phenomenology is so much in terms of his self-consciousness in and through us. And this may depend on how you read his theology. He purports, you see, he thinks of himself as a Lutheran Christian. He explicitly, however, rejects ex nihilo creation. And that part is important. You see, that's what makes him a panentheist. Everything is in God. But if he's a panentheist and not a pantheist, you might well be asking, Cale, well, if everything is in God, but God is more than everything, does he have any leftover self-consciousness that's not our self-consciousness, individually or collectively? You see? Or does the creation, as it were, exhaust the consciousness of the divine being? Well, it certainly seems to me he ought to say the latter. Yet I don't think he does. And it may be that his response to the leftover question would be, well, history isn't finished yet. So at any stage in history, there is still more self-consciousness that God is going to have. Now, that's an odd way to put it. God is going to have more self-consciousness. You see. But the point is that if consciousness is a process, if he agrees with Kant that time is the form of consciousness, you see, then there is, as long as there is divine being and divine consciousness, there is more consciousness going on in history. But is that always divine consciousness in and through the creation? And I don't find him saying it's not. But I don't want to prejudge it. The only other comment I can make, I think, is this, that if we are to know anything about the divine consciousness, it can only be through the creation. And if it can only be through the creation, then what that remainder of consciousness left over is, we've no way of knowing. Which I think follows. Look a little more closely here. The thesis, antithesis, synthesis triad in the historical unfolding of absolute spirit is in art, religion, and philosophy. And the initially interesting thing is to see how he differentiates those three. Some of you in literature or art may have found yourself asking, now, what is the difference between what literature is doing and what philosophy is doing when literary people get sort of philosophical? And Hegel would say it's the form in which, the way in which expression finds articulation. The arts are using images, artistic images. Sure, and to this day you hear people in literature talking of the images that are used in a writer. You hear Joel Sheasley over in the art department in painting talking of images. He recently had a show in Chicago that we went to see, one of the galleries in River North area. And yeah, all sorts of images of suburbia that seem to be truncated and chopped off. You see. And if you know Sheasley, you know what he was trying to convey by those visual images. Namely, the incompleteness, the paucity of life in suburbia, which is less than the whole story. His last show was a series of paintings about poverty in Latin America. Get the two in contrast. You can see what he's doing. But by the use of visual images. And the poet will use verbal images. Wordsworth's Ode to Daffodils, wandering lonely as a cloud that floats on high or hill and vale. Images in talking about the romanticist vision of life. And so that's the nature of art, the German term built image. Now, obviously, the term image is cognate of imagination, which is the distinctive activity of the artist. Not so much craft in applying the pigments. There's imagination in coming up with the images. Thinking imaginatively, that is to say, in images. And that, of course, is the romanticist view of art. The expression of the human spirit, in imagination. And accordingly, as he traces out the unfolding of the history of art, you'll find that sort of thing given expression. He moves from, for instance, Egyptian art, which was more religious and symbolic, to classical art, which has more emphasis on rational harmony and order, to romantic art, which overflows the order in its imaginative expression. There's an unfolding of it as art finds its own self-understanding, conscious being. And then religion, which speaks symbolically, for stellum, a representation. It was Kant's word for a representation. But the representation is not the reality. The representation is the idea that stands for the reality. And the way Hegel uses it, the term symbol becomes significant, symbolic representation, pictorial representation. And so religious language is the language of a symbolic story, you see. Not necessarily parable, historical story, myth, and so forth. The term myth does not judge the question of historical or not historical. Mythos is a story that has religious meaning. So the religious form of expression, then, is this pictorial representation, symbol, and so forth. And so he understands religion in those ways. Symbolic representation. And he traces the history of religious expression from Oriental religion, which was largely pantheist, everything is one, to Greek religion, which is polytheistic, there's the antithesis. There are many deities, finite deities. To the Christian religion, which is Trinitarian, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, combining the infinity of God with the finite expression of the deity. Infinite spirit incarnate in all of history. That's what the incarnation means. The story of the incarnation is a symbol of the way in which God is immanent in everything that happens in history. The story is a picture of that. So he regards Trinitarian Christianity as the highest expression of religion. Christian theology as its symbols being appropriate. But notice that the question of historical truth is the leftover question there. But then it is in philosophy that you find the pure concept as the form of expression. The philosopher, in his analysis of concepts, tries to avoid metaphor, imagery, story, and to conceptualize with clear and distinct thought. You see. That's the function of philosophy. Dealing with the begriff, the concept of being. Not picture stories about, not images of, but conceptualizing in a non-sensory way. So you get these 3 forms, then, of expression of the consciousness of being. But keep in mind that while it may be the individual's self-expression at one level, more ultimately it's all the expression of the divine consciousness coming out through the individual in the cultural setting. Well, what you see then in Hegel's view of religion comes through fairly clearly. First of all, he has an immanentistic kind of theology. That is to say, God is immanent in everything else. The transcendence of God is in traditional Judeo-Christian thought. The transcendence of God is numerical distinctness from the creation. That is lost. God is immanent. And consequently, any notion of supernatural act is regarded as religious symbol, picture, rather than as historically true. There is no act of divine revelation because everything that goes on within the human spirit is God's self-manifestation. All understanding is subsumed within that inner self-expression. This is related to the concept of the death of God, a phrase which he uses and later writers pick up. That is to say, the death of the picture of a transcendent deity. That's a concept of God which dies in the unfolding history of religious thought. Secondly, you have his criticism of certain other views of religion. So let's call this his criticism of Schleiermacher in his immediate context, and Kant on matters of religion. Kant, of course, had tended to reduce religion to ethics, and Schleiermacher criticized him for that. But Schleiermacher tended to define religion in terms of a feeling of dependence on the all-encompassing absolute. To which Hegel responds, if the feeling of dependence were the core of religion, then the most religious of all creatures is the dog. Even Hegel had something of a sense of humor. His point being that obviously there is something phenomenologically awry in that description of religion. Above feelings of dependence, you have the imagination involved in the arts. You have the symbolizing activity involved in religious stories. God is a son. God begat. God makes, he creates, he's creator. You see, the symbolism of religion is going significantly beyond